want to welcome everybody with us today, those that are joining us from Facebook and YouTube. We thank you for joining us. God bless you. Our prayers are with you. Our prayer focus today, I wanted to read it from the NIV version. It comes from Psalms 103, verse 13. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. And as we've sung in our worship this morning, he is the good Father. He is the example of fathership. The love that he's given, I thought of the scripture in one of the sentences in one of the songs. I'll go see that in a little bit. But there's a verse coming in, something you're going to see here in a little bit, where he gave his only son because he loved us. He's a good father. There's a lot to that. We can spend time on that, but that's not our focus today. So anyway, today we're going to celebrate our fathers. We have some gifts and support. We'll pass out a little later to you that are with us. But our subject today, I decided to just look into some of the different fathers. Well, there it is. That are through the Bible. There's many different examples. Of course, one that always pops up is the good father in the story of the prodigal son. He never gave up hope on his prodigal son, and he saw him come home one day. His other son got a little upset, but the father was there for the other son. You know, he didn't give up on his sons. And that's a story that's in Luke chapter 15, if somebody wants to read that later this week. But we need to focus all the time, really, but especially this week as you go through this week, focus on the Father's love and compassion for you, for us. Abraham was faithful to God, and he was faithful to the promised son. And he became the father of a great nation. Even though that he trusted God to the limit with his son, all the way up to the sacrifice that God told him to do. And God stayed his arm. Faithful to God and faithful to the promised son. Jesse had 8 sons. And they were all healthy and strong. But God chose the youngest. He was, in the King James Version, they call him Rudy. I aimed to look into that further, and I got past it and forgot to. But he was just a young boy. But he was the one chosen to be anointed king of Israel. But Jesse, the father of David, and the lineage goes on down to Jesus Christ. And you got to think a little bit about Noah. For his family, he worked hard for 100, 120 years. There's some people think different things there, but he worked hard for them years. Not just for his family, although he was told from the beginning that the ark would be built for him, his wife, his sons, and his son's wife. That was foretold from the beginning. Wasn't like that God just pronounced doom on everybody. There was a reason for the flood. But the knowledge, the foreknowledge of God was that nobody would accept Noah's preaching for all them years. God knew that from the beginning, that there would only be 8 go on the ark. But we're going to look into Esther chapter 2. And this is, I don't know, it just kind of touched me. We're going to read verse 5 through 7 real quick here, and then just talk about Esther and Mordecai. Starting in verse 5 of chapter 2 of Esther. In Shushan, the citadel, in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with captives who had been captured with Zedekiah, king of Judah, from whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The woman was lovely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So really Mordecai and Esther were cousins, if it was his uncle's daughter. But obviously he must have been older, and he took Esther in as his own daughter. So he became the father to Esther. And as you go through the book of Esther, this would be another good study. It's this week. It's just 10 chapters of all that Esther and Mordecai go through this week. Mordecai discovered a plot that was against the king. And he gets the word through some of the king's men to the king, and situations taken care of, and a couple of guys that was going to try to take on the king ended up getting hung. And anyway, there came up a man, Haman, who was like number 1 man under the king, and he became real jealous of Mordecai, and he seeks to cause him harm. But the king wants to honor him for what he's done. So things ain't going Haman's way too well. But he starts doing many different things. But one thing he did was he convinced the king to write a new law. And in Persia, this is what this kingdom is, the kingdom of Persians and Medes. In this kingdom, the law was, once the king made a law, he couldn't go back on it. He couldn't take that law back. It had to stand. So, unbeknownst to the king and who it was really, because he didn't really know Esther was a Jew and Mordecai was a Jew. Well, I guess he knew Mordecai was a Jew, but there was some things coming up that, anyway, they got a law passed that they would take up arms against the Jews because of things that Haman had set up with the king to get his mind going that way. And Esther talks to Mordecai and agrees to help the Jews. And it becomes quite a story. Esther has to tell the story to the king some way, but you just go before the king anytime in this time around here. If the king chooses not to recognize it, you're hung. You're taken out and hung. If he chooses not to recognize it, you've done a wrong worthy of the Persian law to be hung. So Esther had to be careful in what she did. So she knew that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So she prepares this big banquet for the king and for Haman and for all of them. And now things are set up now. You got to remember, things are set up for the Persians to take up arms against the Jews. And mainly because of Haman's grudge against Mordecai. And he's in a position where he can do that. But my point in holding on to Mordecai as a father here to Esther, he's with her, even though he's not in the king's temple, he's hanging around the gate of the temple. He's there for her. She can get messages to him and through the eunuchs that would send messages back and forth. She could get messages to Mordecai and he could get messages back to her. You could see this was set up. God was allowing them to talk to one another. But anyway, in all this time, the queen was requested by the king. I can't remember the first queen's name right now. Vashti.
Vashti.
Yeah, Vashti. All right. Anyway, she was requested to come to the king's presence, and she turned him down. Well, that's a no-no. So they go through a big ordeal figuring out what they're going to do with the queen. So anyway, that was the end of her as queen. And so he puts out the order for a bunch of ladies to be brought in before him, and he likes Esther. She's one that's chosen, and he likes Esther, and that's how she gets put in a position of queen. And he really liked her. She was a beautiful lady, and king really favored her over all the other ladies that he had. This is Persia, but even the kings of Judah and Israel would, as we know, Solomon had between wives and concubines, it was about 1,000 ladies. So it's just something about that time that men of these days just can't handle that many. And
God forbid.
I think we finally matured enough to know we can't handle that. At least most of us have. Anyway, just a remark from me. But anyway, Esther has her banquet, invites the king and Haman and all of them in, and she comes around and puts out the word that her and all her people, this is when she exposes herself to the king as a Jew, that her and all of her people are going to be warred against, and there'll be a lot of destruction. And of course the king wants to know who set up this plot. And he finds out it's Haman, and that's the end of Haman. Like I say, things happen quick. It don't take years upon years and appeals and everything to get this taking place back then, like it does in our day and time. But Haman had set this up in a against Mordecai, where he was going to try to get Mordecai hung, and he had built a special scaffold for him. And it's to my understanding, it was approximately 50 foot high. It's going to be a high enough hanging that everybody can see, I guess. And but anyway, when the king found out that Haman set up this plot against Mordecai, and by this time the king has come to know Mordecai and has a respect for him because he saved the king's life, most likely. So Haman gets hung on his own scaffold. There's a shame in that. Back when, years ago, there used to be some tomfoolery going on at work where people would throw 5 gallons of water on people's heads. They have thrown whole barrels of water. Now that's an experience you don't want to experience. But I've taken plenty of the 5 gallons. It's just things that happen. But there was a big shame because people go around and set up buckets of water all through the stills in the building. And it was a big shame if you got your own bucket. If you'd set up something to get somebody else with, you ended up taking your own bucket. The word got around. You couldn't keep it secret. And it was a big shame to get wet by your own bucket. And so it's kind of like Haman here, only a little more deadly. The Haman ends up getting hung on his own scaffold that he had built to hang Mordecai on. So anyway, the story goes on, and Mordecai, after the hanging, the Jews were still facing, because the king can't take back the order of the attack against the Jews. He can't take it back. So he ordered that the Jews be armed to where they can defend themselves. He added another law to it. So by the help of God, this come out real successful for the Jews. And that settled that down, and Mordecai is made the king's right-hand man in the kingdom after that. But it's all because of his focus to take care of his younger cousin, Esther, and raise her. And he obviously raised her with good convictions, to make good choices, to stand for what is true. And God's blessed him and put him in a place of authority now. And the tormentors that is called in this Bible that come against the Jews got destroyed. And everything becomes all better for the Jews for that time. We know that eventually it comes time, if you read on into the writings of the other prophets in the scripture here, we'll find that they start getting sent back to Israel to rebuild and refurbish the Israel, even to build the barn and rebuild the walls around Israel and so forth. But at this time, they're still in captivity in Persia, but they're at this time things is made better for them. Mordecai is made the king's right-hand man, kind of like what Joseph went through. All Joseph went through from his brothers being sold into slavery and being Potiphar's slave, and then falsely accused, ended up spending time in prison. But all through the things that Joseph went through, he became the man through going through that God wanted him to be placed the king's or Pharaoh's right-hand man to take care of Egypt. So God blesses his people. when they stand through the people. And that's what we need to see. We mentioned earlier about, we were talking to somebody about the signs following believers. We need to really take that to heart. God's got reason for His glory to be seen in this world. And His glory will be seen through the efforts of His people to take His word and truth to the world around us. But we always need to remember and to teach. It is the glory of God only. So anyway, we want to thank everybody for joining us, and those of you that have joined us from Facebook and YouTube, we thank you for that. And ask that you remember us, keep praying for us, and join us later in church anytime you can, and at sometime around 11:15 on Facebook. So thank you